Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt your fun, but we are about to start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Grolier Club. It's very nice to have you, and welcome also to our online friends zooming in from various places, including our friends at FABS. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jordan Ross, who's a joint Ph.D. student at the University of Pennsylvania with the Department of History in the Graduate School of Education. His research explores the history of African American archives, education, and cultural life during the 19th and early 20th centuries, with a focus on how Black communities built, preserved, and circulated knowledge in the post-emancipation period. A digital humanist as much as a historian, Jordan uses digital tools to uncover, interpret, and share underrepresented Black historical narratives. His work lives at the intersection of African American history, the history of education, public history, and digital humanities, melding archival research with public-facing interactive storytelling. He's a former Price Mellon Fellow at Penn's Price Lab for Digital Humanities and currently serves as Vice Chair of the Historical Commission of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Incorporated. In 2024, Jordan was awarded the David Ruggles Grand Prize and named a Junior Fellow at the Library of Congress, where he co-led a research initiative on Black authored textbooks and racial representation at the 1900 Paris Exposition. So he will speak, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. And please join me in welcoming to the podium.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and then good evening, and thank you all for being here. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude for Eve for the kind invitation to present tonight. It is a pleasure and an honor to speak with you here at the Grolier Club, a place that has long championed the art of collecting, the craft of the book, and the intellectual lives of those who love them. I'd like to begin in June of 1887, when Philadelphia historian and journalist Gertrude Mazel sounded an alarm. Black history, what she called race history, was vanishing. After only 2 hours visiting 2 private collections, she feared that too much had already been lost. Her first stop was at the parlor of William H. Dorsey, a Black artist and scrapbooker who had spent 35 years gathering clippings, manuscripts, and rare pamphlets documenting Black life. No love of the Negro race could be other than benefited by viewing this interesting collection, she wrote. Her next visit took her to the home of Robert Purvis, the veteran abolitionist and Underground Railroad leader. His library was filled with abolitionist newspapers, Vigilance Committee certificates, and keepsakes from decades of activism. On the wall hung an etching of John Brown with an original musket from his raid above it, a stark reminder of the stakes of Harper's Ferry. At age 77, Purvis was still rummaging through closets to show fugitive slave passes and letters to anyone eager to glimpse the past. To Mazel, history was never abstract. It began with facts concerning first an individual, next a family, and extending outward. She urged Black people to see it as a privilege to, quote, gather these scraps of history, end quote. But she also recognized the precariousness of this work also. We have begun to take some interest in ourselves, she wrote, but not the amount that we should have, end quote. She warned that the materials then accessible and inexpensive would soon be locked away in white-controlled institutions or priced beyond the ordinary reader. In 5 years, she predicted, reconstructing a full account of Black life in any major city might be impossible. And indeed, much had already vanished. Out of this sense of urgency, Mazel issued a call. She said, quote, let us get to work and gather up the fragments. Each of us has some book or pamphlet we could contribute. Let us begin to form an historical society. A decade later, Black Philadelphians answered that call. In 1897, She assisted with founding the Afro-American Historical Society of the city of Philadelphia, soon renamed the American Negro Historical Society, one of the first historical societies established by Black people in the United States. Its mission was simple but radical: to collect relics, literature, and historical facts relative to the African race. In an era when historians dismissed Black contributions and public institutions refused to preserve them, these men and women built their own reading rooms, hosted lectures, and protected rare materials. They preserved what they might otherwise have disappeared. This brings me to what I call a Black bibliophile tradition, a deep intergenerational practice of collecting, preserving, and sharing books and records of Black life as acts of both love and resistance. From Dorsey's scrapbooks to Purvis's abolitionist archives, from Mosell's call to gather up the fragments, to the work of William C. Bolivar and others, Black Philadelphians understood that collecting was not a hobby, it was a form of power. Bolivar captured this perfectly. He once laminated meeting a child who asked, "Who is Frederick Douglass?" A college-educated man who had never heard of Harriet Tubman. For him, collecting preserved not only knowledge, but racial identity. His friend Henry L. Phillips later wrote, Bolivar's, quote, hobby was books, rare books that tell of achievements of the race, not to fill the shelves, but to fill the mind with useful race doings. Tonight, I want to explore that tradition, the networks of collectors, of the readers, and bibliophiles who created a culture of Black historical preservation in Philadelphia. We'll see how their libraries became sites of memory, how their books became tools of freedom, how their efforts laid groundwork for the later Black archival traditions and historical movements across the country. In tracing this story, I hope to show that the Black bibliophile tradition was and remains more than a love of books. It was a collective effort to safeguard the record of Black life against erasure, to claim history as a right, and to ensure that the story of people could never be lost again. So, how did the bibliophile tradition in Philadelphia begin? Philadelphia, by the early 19th century, was more than a political and cultural hub of Black life. It was also a fertile ground for archiving, for preserving memory through books, pamphlets, and records. By the 1820s, the city's free Black population was among the largest in the nation, sustained by institutions that fostered literacy, mutual aid, and collective memory. Through literary societies, debating clubs, and schools like the Institute for Colored Youth, Black Philadelphians developed habits of reading and collecting that would echo for generations. These weren't just cultural activities, they were strategies of survival and assertion, ways of saying, we will record our own history because no one else will do it for us. One of the earliest examples came in 1828 with the Colored Reading Room Society, founded by William Whipper, J.P. Roberts, and Reverend J.C. Ward. Their mission was, in their words, quote, the mental improvement of the people of color in the neighborhood of Philadelphia, end quote. The reading room was modest, but it introduced something revolutionary, a space where Black people across the country could access and preserve printed materials collectively, outside of white control. Whipper, still a young businessman at the time, would go on to become one of the city's leading abolitionists. He believed education was inseparable from moral progress, and that the community's freedom depended on its own libraries. His conviction found form in 1833 when he co-founded the Philadelphia Library Company of Colored Persons. Its goal was to create, quote, a library of useful works of every description, end quote, for readers barred from the city's white institutions. Within just a few years, it held over 600 volumes, history, science, literature, and served in more than 100 members. It became one of the first Black-controlled libraries in the United States, a cornerstone of the Black bibliophile tradition. This tradition also found expression in the African Methodist Episcopal Church's Book Concern, one of the earliest Black-owned publishing houses in the country. From its Philadelphia headquarters, it produced newspapers, pamphlets, and religious texts. most famously their Christian Recorder, founded in 1852. Those pages preserved sermons, editorials, and correspondence that documented Black life. The AME Press didn't just spread religious thought. It built an infrastructure of record keeping, a print-based archive of the Black experience. Founded in, gotta go back. I feel like I'm getting my stuff mixed up. Yeah, I know, like this is like super important. Yeah, I'm gonna feel like I get my stuff. Nevertheless, and we must not overlook the women who shaped this literary world. In 1831, Sarah Mapps Douglas founded the Female Literary Association, one of the earliest Black women's literary societies in the nation. Through reading, writing, and mutual critique, members cultivated both intellect and solidarity. They modeled the idea that literacy itself could be a form of liberation. A few years later, the Minerva Literary Association followed their lead, demonstrating that women's literary labor was essential to Philadelphia's emerging archival culture. By the 1830s and 1840s, the city pulsed with Black-led intellectual societies, the Rush Library Company and Debating Society, the Demosthenes Institute, the Gilbert Lyceum, and all combined libraries with lectures and debates. These spaces trained speakers, thinkers, and record keepers. They wove together civic life and the printed word. Setting the stage for what came next, the most enduring of all these associations, the Banneker Institute. Founded in 1853 at the home of Redmond Fawcett, who is the father of the literary writer Jessie Fawcett, the Banneker Institute quickly became the heartbeat of Black intellectual life in Philadelphia. Its name honored Benjamin Banneker, the mathematician and almanac writer who symbolized Black genius. From its earliest days, the Institute brought together teachers, ministers, artists, and activists, young men and women committed to self-education and public discourse. The Banneker Institute ran lectures and debates, a circulating library. Between 1854 and 1855 alone, it hosted more than 20 lectures on slavery, politics, and education, drawing figures like Charles L. Reason, James Forten, Robert Douglas, and William Wells Brown. Their annual Emancipation Day and Banneker Day celebrations blended learning with commemoration, turning memory itself into a public act. Members took pride in their library, describing it as one could shed a halo of literary light throughout the city. They saw books as a guiding star, steering their people upon the trackless ocean towards freedom and dignity. In other words, the library was a compass for collective aspiration. Contemporaries recognized its importance. In 1858, William Steele praised the Banneker Institute as, quote, the only library company amongst us that seems really entitled to much respect or support, end quote. He understood that this was more than a club. It was a repository of Black knowledge sustained by Black hands. At the heart stood Jacob C. White, Jr., only 16 when he co-founded the Institute. White became its secretary and record keeper, carefully preserving minutes, ledgers, and correspondence. An archivist before the term had weight. He even led efforts to transcribe important manuscripts and to purchase Benjamin Banneker's papers. His handwritten notes, neat and deliberate, there's kind of an example right there, carried weight of a collective memory. When White petitioned for the Institute's admission into the city's all-white literary congress and was denied on racial grounds, he and his peers didn't give up. Instead, they deepened their own commitment for preservation, understanding that keeping their own records was in itself a political act. As one committee wrote, quote, the cultivation of literature is a matter of sterling importance because of the connection it enables us to keep between the past and the present, end quote. That phrase, the connection between the past and the present, is the heart of Philadelphia's Black bibliophile tradition. Collecting was never just about gathering books. It was about building bridges of memory, strong enough to withstand exclusion and erasure. The Banneker spirit lived on even after its decline. One of its members, Robert Adger Jr., carried forward its collecting impulse into the late 19th century, building a private library that would become the foundation of the American Negro Historical Society. Alongside Adger was William H. Dorsey, the scrapbooker who chronicled decades of Black Philadelphia life, and William C. Bolivar, the educator and bibliophile who saw books as instruments of racial uplift. Together, these men represented the continuity between the mid-century literary societies, and the organized archival movement of the 1890s. Out of their effort grew the institutional form of the Black bibliophile tradition, one rooted in reading, collecting, and preserving the story of people determined never to be forgotten. By the closing years of the 19th century, the work of preserving Black history had become both urgent and precarious. The literary societies that once powered Philadelphia's intellectual life had faded. Their records were scattered, their libraries dissolved. Meanwhile, historians were busily writing African Americans out of the national story. Professional history, as it was being defined in the 1880s and 1890s, celebrated what it called Anglo-Saxon progress. Major libraries excluded Black readers. Universities offered no space for the study of Black life. And so, as the historical profession consolidated its authority, it did so by erasing the very people who helped shape the nation. If African American history was to be preserved at all, it would have to be through a Black initiative. This realization was not limited to Philadelphia. Across the country, thinkers and veterans of the freedom struggle felt the same urgency. In 1883, the historian Civil War veteran George Washington Williams issued a call for the formation of an American Negro Historical Society, urging Black communities everywhere to gather and preserve their own histories. Around the same time in Atlanta, Floyd Henry Crumley organized a similar society, hoping to demonstrate, as he put it, that Black people are truly American. But it was in Philadelphia, with its long, fertile tradition of collecting and literacy, that this tradition took lasting root. When Abel P. Caldwell called a meeting on October 18th, 1897, at the parish house of the Church of the Crucifixion, he was standing on the ground already prepared by decades of bibliophiles, Robert Adger Jr., William Dorsey, William Bolivar, and others who had been building a personal archive for years. 1 week later, on October 25th, 1897, they officially organized the Afro-American Historical Society of the city of Philadelphia. Its constitution pledged to collect relics, literature, and historical facts relative to the African race, and to document their progress and development in this country. This was a declaration of both pride and protest. An instance of Black history belonged not in the margins of white institutions, but in the hands of Black communities themselves. At their next meeting, a debate broke out over the organization's name. Frederick G. Barbados, an associate of Frederick Douglass, proposed changing Afro-American to the American Negro Historical Society. Some objected, including Allen Ricketts, who resigned in protest over the term Negro. Yet the motion passed, a sign of how deeply these founders understood the politics of representation. The name aligned them with the national identity, African Americans as both fully American and fully historical. It is worth pausing here to name the founders, because to say their names aloud is an act of recovery. They included Thaddeus Madding, Robert M. Adger Jr., Alfred Casey, Reverend Henry L. Phillips, Reverend Matthew Anderson, William C. Bolivar, William H. Dorsey, Professor Edward Alexander Bouchette, Charles H. Brooks, Walter P. Hall, Robert Jones, Edward F. Harris, Thomas Ringgold, Hans Schad, Allen Ricketts, W.A.W. Baugh, Henry S. Martin, P. Albert Dutriell, William Potter, Theophilus J. Minton, James W. Caldwell, and Abel P. Caldwell. These were clergy, educators, businessmen, craftsmen, and editors, a cross-section of Black Philadelphia's leadership who transformed scattered private collections into a permanent institution. Although the founding roster was male, the question of women's membership emerged almost immediately. According to later recollections, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the great poet, abolitionist, and lecturer, was present in early discussions of the society's creation. By January 1898, she was publicly pressing the men on the questions of women's participation. At one meeting, she was introduced as a, quote, living historical relic, end quote, a term both reverent and ironic. As she asked directly, would women be admitted? Robert Adger, as the minutes record, quote, adopted the better part of valor and did not answer her overtures. But the issue would not be silenced. By 1904, Harper and several other women, Sarah Elizabeth Cole Phillips, Fanny J. Coppin, Gertrude Mazel, and Harper's daughter Mary Harper, were all listed as members. Their inclusion reflected what had been true all along, that women's intellectual labor had always been central to Philadelphia's bibliophile tradition. Among the men, several figures defined the society's character. Abel P. Caldwell, born in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in 1865, was the first corresponding secretary. A newspaperman and activist, he had long used his editorials to fight for integration and education. Caldwell was the strategist, the brain of the operation. He transformed a loose collecting impulse into a structured society. But others remembered it was Robert M. Adger Jr., not Caldwell, who had first conceived of such a group. Adger was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1837, had built one of the largest private libraries of African American history in the city. Hundreds of portraits, pamphlets, and relics. He became the society's first president. If Caldwell was the brain, Adger was the heart. His lifelong devotion to collecting made the society possible. Then there was William H. Dorsey, elected the first custodian, or what we might today call a curator. His home was a museum, lined with nearly 400 scrapbooks documenting every facet of Black life, from portraits of Phyllis Wheatley, a newspaper clipping of local politics. Dorsey was the memory, the careful steward who made sure nothing was lost. William C. Bolivar, the educator and bibliophile, was the voice. Through his column Pencil Pusher Points in the Philadelphia Tribune, he reflected the society's work and kept its mission alive in print. And finally, Henry Phillips, a rector of the Church of Crucifixion, was its foundation. His parish provided meeting space, the archives, and the spiritual home that kept the society grounded. Together, Caldwell, the brain, Adger, the heart, Dorsey, the memory, Bolivar, the voice, and Phillips, the foundation. They transform a local collecting impulse into a lasting institution. The American Negro Historical Society grew. It attracted some of the most important Black figures in the city and the nation. Christopher J. Perry, the founder of the Philadelphia Tribune, William Steele, the Underground Railroad chronicler, Jacob C. White Jr., co-founder of the Banneker Institute, Robert Purvis, abolitionist, Nathan F. Mazel, the first Black graduate of Penn Medical School, Richard Robert Wright Jr., editor of the Christian Recorder. Their participation turned the American Negro Historical Society into more than a library. It became a center of Black intellectual and civic life, a living expression of the Black bibliophile tradition at its highest form. The founding of the American Negro Historical Society marked a turning point. What had once been scattered in attics and parlors, scrapbooks, letters, clippings, and pamphlets was now gathered under a single name and mission. The American Negro Historical Society stood as both preservation and protest, a declaration that Black people would be the custodians of their own history. Beyond collecting, the society held lectures, mounted exhibitions, hosted Emancipation Day celebrations. In doing so, they transformed preservation into a living, breathing practice of community history. In short, the American Negro Historical Society institutionalized what had been true in Philadelphia for nearly a century, that to collect was to care, that to preserve was to resist, and that books, records, and relics were never just artifacts. They were acts of freedom. If the early years of the American Negro Historical Society embodied the promise of Black archiving, the decades that followed revealed its precarity. For every lecture given or artifact displayed, there lingered the looming threat of loss. Through fire, neglect, or indifference, this tension between preservation and erasure shaped the society's work and reflected the broader vulnerability of African American memory. That danger became painfully real in 1903, when a fire at the parish of the Church of the Crucifixion destroyed much of the society's original collection. Years of careful gathering, donations, rare pamphlets, and portraits, memorabilia, were reduced to ashes in a single night. For members, This was not simply the destruction of objects, but the obliteration of painstakingly assembled proof of Black achievement. The fire made visible what the society already knew: Black archives and the labor of Black bibliophiles who sustained them existed under constant threat. The American Negro Historical Society survived the fire thanks to Amelia L. White, the widow of Jacob C. White, Jr., who donated her husband's late collection to help rebuild the archives. As a longtime secretary of the Banneker Institute, Jacob White had preserved minutes, membership rolls, and personal manuscripts. Amelia's gift effectively grafted the Banneker's legacy onto the American Negro Historical Society, reviving its mission through acts of community stewardship. Her contribution underscores a critical truth: the preservation of Black history often underscores that it depended on the dedication of Black bibliophiles and the intellectual labor of women. Yet the threat of forgetting remained. William Bolivar recalled a telling moment. While speaking with educated Black peers, some of them school teachers, he mentioned the names of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. To his dismay, they responded, "Who are they?" This encounter made clear the stakes. It was not only the loss of objects, but the erasure of collective memory itself. The American Negro Historical Society responded decisively, using its lecture series to recover and circulate knowledge about John Brown, Thaddeus Stevens, the architects of the Haitian Revolution, and other figures central to African American history. These lectures were rigorous undertakings, rooted in research and verification. Bolivar emphasized that history was, quote, not mere say-so and tradition, but the result of facts, end quote. For example, when a rumor circulated that John Brown kissed a Black child on his way to the gallows, newspapers dismissed it as myth. Yet, inspired by Whittier's poem, Dorsey investigated and ultimately found an eyewitness who confirmed the story. It was this that the American Negro Historical Society demonstrated the painstaking care of Black bibliophiles and historians. Recovering the past was not hearsay, but by evidence. The Society's dedication earned quite the recognition. In 1904, Andrew C. McLaughlin, editor of the American Historical Review, encouraged Harper and Brother Books publishers to consult the American Negro Historical Society. By 1905, the Society appeared in the American Historical Review's annual report, the only Black historical organization listed. This acknowledgement, although modest, affirmed that the meticulous work of Philadelphia's Black bibliophiles was shaping not just the local memory, but the national historical record. Tragically, the fragility of Black archives was reaffirmed in 1912 when a fire at the Philadelphia Tribune plant destroyed nearly all of the known back issues. Founded by a long-term member of the American Negro Historical Society, Christopher J. Perry, the Tribune had functioned as both a newspaper and a living repository of Black history. Alongside Bolivar, Perry had used it to document civic life, commemorate leaders, and to celebrate African American achievements. The destruction of decades of issues erased a significant portion of Philadelphia's Black bibliophile legacy, leaving only fragments of a once vibrant record. Yet, the work endured. Will the people come out and learn Bolivar Acts to get inspiration to do better than their forebears by attending the next season's free lecture? This was more than a question. It was a call to action. The American Negro Historical Society demonstrated that Black bibliophiles were not merely collectors of books and relics. They were guardians of memory, educators, and activists, ensuring that history remained alive and relevant. In a society that often ignored or distorted the Black past, their labor was indispensable. Memory was fragile, but through research, collection, and education, it could be fortified. In the fight against forgetting, the society never wavered. The story of the American Negro Historical Society did not end with fire or neglect. It faded slowly, then all at once. The passing of key figures marked the unraveling of an institution that held together an extraordinary individual commitment. Robert Adger died in 1910, Bolivar in 1914, Caldwell in 1917, Dorsey in 1923. With their loss, the intellectual and emotional core of the society weakened. What had been a vibrant grassroots collective, driven by research, lectures, and collecting in community, entered dormancy. Like many Black-led institutions of the era, the American Negro Historical Society had no endowment, infrastructure, or succession plan. It relied on people. When they were gone, the society faltered. By 1930, it was reported as out of existence, and many believed the archival collection was lost forever. Yet, these materials they gathered, the products of a lifetime of collecting, cataloging, and preserving, did not vanish. Leon Gardner, a Black Philadelphia historian and collector, rediscovered the remnants of the society's holdings in the attic of a Black church, just before they were about to be discarded. Gardner's intervention was an act of quiet foresight, but it was no accident. Initiated into the world of Black archiving as a child and having joined the American Negro Historical Society in its final years, he carried forward the legacy of the Black Bibliophile tradition. Ordinary men and women, working by day in humble professions, devoted by night to preserving an intellectual and cultural record of their community. Like Adger, Gardner understood that collecting was not merely a personal pursuit, it was a civic and historical work. Gardner continued the Society's mission by giving public lectures and publishing editorials in the Philadelphia Tribune, spreading the gospel of Black history to a new generation both inside the classroom and in the broader community. He collaborated with the Philadelphia branch of the Association of the Study of Negro Life and History and the Philadelphia Society for Negro Records and Research, embedding himself into the city's network of Black historical preservation and interpretation. In December 1933, Gardner donated the salvage materials to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, commemorating the centennial of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. With this gesture, he ensured the intellectual and documentary legacy of the American Negro Historical Society survived, even if the organization itself did not. What unites all these figures, from the Colored Reading Room Society to the Charles L. Blockson Collection, is not only the love of books, but a belief in their ethical power. For many early white collectors in the 19th century, being a bibliophile was a language of refinement, taste, and possession. For Black collectors, it was a language of endurance. To paste a clipping about a lynching as Dorsey did, or to annotate a pamphlet on emancipation as Bolivar did, was to make a moral record, to say, we will not forget. These collectors remind us that archives are not neutral. They are acts of consciousness. They also remind us that scholarship is communal, built by hands that clip, glue, annotate, and catalog, often without recognition. Before I close, I'll share that this lecture draws on my ongoing research. I plan to explore this tradition further in my dissertation tentatively titled Seekers, Finders, and Givers, A History of Archiving, Race, and Education in Philadelphia, 1828 to 1945. That project builds upon the very figures we met tonight, tracing how their bibliophile and archival practices shape Black intellectual life, historical consciousness, and the educational thought of over more than a century. So tonight, as we gather here among fellow lovers of the book, I invite us to imagine the bibliophile not as a solitary collector, but as a custodian of community. When Robert Adger cataloged a pamphlet, when William Dorsey glued another clipping, when Charles Blockson traveled across states to find that rare single volume, they were doing more than saving objects. They were preserving possibility, the possibility that future generations would have the evidence they needed to know themselves. That, I believe, is the heart of the Black bibliophile tradition in Philadelphia, a tradition rooted in reading, carried forward in collecting, and consecrated in the act of remembering. Thank you. Questions?
Oh, that was wonderful. Wow. So I have two comments. One, in about the third or fourth photograph, you showed Bolivar, who I assume is not related to Simone, with a bunch of circular things in the background.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Those are photo portraits, which would mean he was one of the first to want to archive the images as well as the words of his people.
Mm-hmm.
But for the people in this room who, and wherever, would you explain more about Charles Blockson, Yeah, Bloxon, who has, you tossed in there into the mix, but he deserves a whole separate series of lectures.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, Bloxon deserves an entire lecture in himself. Like even with my dissertation, I end on Bloxon with a coda because he deserves an entire work in itself. And like we discussed earlier, like my first semester when I got to Penn, he unfortunately passed away, and I never got a chance to meet him. But Bloxon is this amazing bibliophile. He's really, I mean, he's the self-expression of the Black bibliophile tradition in Philadelphia, especially after everyone is gone. Because Leon Gardner, I think he passed away 1945, around that time. So there were not that many of the bibliophiles in Philadelphia left. And Bloxon, becomes a bibliophile as a child because of a teacher who told him, I think, that Black people didn't have any history, so he begins collecting. He has multiple mentors, even like Paul Robeson's a mentor to him in his collecting traditions. And he's just a great example. And even the title of my dissertation comes from what Bloxon wanted to be remembered as: a seeker, a finder, and a giver.
It was a great talk.
1933.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So, scrapbooks come up a lot, and it's something that I'm pretty interested in. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the function of scrapbooks as preserving an archive and what that meant specifically to the Black community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, scrapbooks are really, really important. I was honored to get a chance to look at Dorsey's scrapbooks. They're housed at Penn State University and owned by Cheyney University, which was the Institute for Colored Youth, which he was a student at. And I mean, Dorsey is like documenting everything from who's being murdered at the time. And especially it becomes important because I mentioned in the lecture that from the Philadelphia Tribune from 1888 around until 1912, like no one has those issues. Like we don't know anything that has happened during that time. And you get bits and pieces of it in the scrapbooks. And Dorsey's really innovative. He has a scrapbook, I think it's called like The Education of Negroes. And he wrote to the Department of Education of the United States, and he was like, give me everything you have on Black authors. And they sent him back this book, and he takes the book and rips it apart and makes his own annotations. He's like, actually, no, this was a colored author. No, this wasn't a colored author. And it's so interesting to see. And I think that in many ways, scrapbooks give you a better picture into the world of these bibliophiles because you see their own handwriting, their own annotations, what they're thinking about at the time. But scrapbooks are amazing.
Just wonderful talk, by the way. Wonderful talk. Can you talk a little bit about the intelligentsia? We know that the AME Church was founded. We know that institutions like the Boulay, like the Lynx, like Jack and Jill, all founded in Philadelphia, which I always find fascinating. I'm assuming that those people were bibliophiles and collectors and helped to do, to uphold the tradition.
So one of the rare pamphlets that results out of the American Negro Historical Society is by Henry Minton, who founded the Boulay. And he has like an amazing talk that he gave to them. Like he's even talking about certain things like, I never knew that the founder of modern ice cream comes from a Black person in Philadelphia. And they're talking about these things consistently all the time. And his, I think it's his grandfather and his father were members of the Banneker Institute. So there's like a direct lineage of these organizations that are being founded, and they're going on to found other organizations. And they all know each other. Like they're being operated on each other, like when they're going to the doctor or, they're going to the bank. Like they're all seeing each other. But it's like this thing where they see each other by day, where they have their jobs, but by night they're collecting and they're discussing these important conversations.
We were talking earlier about how the Purvis books got dispersed at Penn. Can you Can you, and now that I've been enlightened, can you enlighten the rest of the room on that?
Yeah, Purvis's collection deserves like an entire lecture in itself. And if Mitch is online, like hint, hint, hint. Robert Purvis's book collection was donated to the University of Pennsylvania in 1890, 1891, around that time. And this guy, Thomas Walter, who's a Quaker, he's writing in the newspapers, he's like, we need an anti-slavery collection for Penn, because at the time, Penn created an entire school of American history where they were giving degrees in the School of American History. And they thought that his collection should go there. So eventually they acquired the collection, but it was kind of like this secret thing that no one knew was there. There are like slight mentions of it, and they dispersed it within the general collection. So in order to, I guess, rebuild the original Purvis collection, the Penn curators and archivists would have to go through every book, especially like I've seen that they've rebuilt the original library, and most of Purvis's collection is like in the slavery section. I think it's 323 in the Dewey Decimal System or something about that. But there are slight things where you could tell it's Purvis. They'll say Purvins or Purvis or Perns, but they would have to go through every book to recover that original collection. But it's very interesting because Purvis told people that he burnt his library and his collections, but he actually did not. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to hear you talk about this. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how you got started working on the project and what it's been like to work with these materials.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a collector myself, but there was this one book, Black Bibliophiles and Collectors, was this edited volume of this conference at Howard University, which is a rare book in itself, which is like ridiculous. It's like one of the only books besides maybe Laura Helton's book on like dedicated to Black bibliophiles at the time. So they're mentioning, like Dorothy Porter's mentioning like, yeah, like the genesis of like Black bibliophiles as an organized like collecting system is in Philadelphia. Oh, that's interesting. So she talks about the Leon Gardner collection. And I applied to the University of Pennsylvania, to the joint Ph.D. program, and this was like my interest. I was like, look, I want to study Black bibliophiles, and the collection that I want to study is there in Philadelphia. So as soon as I got to Philadelphia, I was all in the Leon Gardner collection and looking at the papers, looking at what they're talking about, finding other people's materials there. Like in the miscellaneous section, there's parts of stuff about Francis Harper that just the archivists at the time didn't think that that was important. So it was just like, I'm just going to start my research and immediately get my hands into it. And it's such an amazing experience just to look at the wonderful things because there are multiple organizations. The Banneker Institute is in there. Parts of William Steele's collection is in their collection. Leon Gardner's own papers are in that collection. And it's just a wonderful sight to see, especially the meeting minutes, to see like the actual handwriting of them talking about these various issues. And it's been a wonderful experience.
Oops. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. As I work in the library at the Grolier Club, and one of the things we collect a lot of are bookseller catalogs. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of informing my question about if you found much information in your research about how these bibliophiles are acquiring their materials. Are they working with booksellers, particular booksellers? Are they kind of finding these things through their own efforts?
So what's interesting is in the minutes, they're not directly talking about the trade that they're getting into, but on they have this big catalog of Leary's bookstore in Philadelphia, and there's like I was telling Eve, it's like written, the minutes are written in shorthand, so I'm trying to like decipher it, but that's kind of a hint in where they're going to, but mostly they're doing like direct solicitation through each other, and even I forgot them. There was a mayor, Samuel something, I'm blanking on his name, who appointed the first Black police officer. Like he's donating stuff to them. They're getting stuff, and even discussing like how do we preserve like this stuff, Now, I wish that they expanded on it more, but they're like, look, we need to figure out a way to preserve these books and these materials. And even in 1903, when the fire happened, I mean, like, they didn't really know what to do. But they're only talking about really direct solicitation amongst each other, and like, so-and-so has given a book today, or so-and-so has donated a particular collection. And they do have a, let's see if I can give an example. Like, they did start a pamphlet. There's like a bunch of pamphlets of like books by colored authors, books by white authors, artifacts. And they started to have these little pamphlet books where you kind of get an insight of who's giving a lecture that day and who's presenting the materials as a gift, but there's no like date on when they acquired that item. But they did talk about if it's a first edition or not. That is in the pamphlet.
One more question. Well, first, they actually had a library stamp over there, purple. Yay. But Philadelphia was, if you put the map back on, was a tiny place stuffed between two rivers, which were both navigable. Was there a black section to speak of? Where was the church? Where were the black churches? Like, was there one, or were they sprinkled? Which seems
they're mainly in South
counterintuitive.
Philadelphia, and I guess we could give the credit to Bloxon of why we know where all these places are, because he put the markers up all around Philadelphia of who these people are. Like Adger has his own marker, Henry Phillips has his own marker. So we know where these people stayed at because Bloxon led that initiative with the Pennsylvania Historical Society all throughout the southern South Philadelphia.
You showed a number of their catalogs. Those aren't sales catalogs. Those are self-published catalogs of their collections. Is that right?
So Adger's
Yeah, right.
Adger's catalog, it was for sale. These were books that he was selling. He has like about 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
But let's see if I can go back to Bolivar. Bolivar's catalog, there's actually a nice story about this. The year that he passed away in 1914, earlier that year, all of the Philadelphia communities, all the Mintons and everybody who's part of these elite black groups surprised him with his own catalog. He never had cataloged his collection, and this was a result. This is housed at the Library of Congress in the Daniel A.P. Murray collection. And even what's interesting about that is that, where's the picture? Jacob C. White, like I was just randomly looking at the microfilms on the Daniel A.P. Murray collection. He sends him a whole list of books that you can still see today. So a lot of Daniel A.P. Murray's collection that, if they relate to somewhat Philadelphia, he got from Jacob C. White, and he sent that to him the year he passed away.
At that cover of the Bolivar catalog, I think that's the longest mini resume I've ever seen on the cover of anyone's book catalog. I love that.
Yeah, they definitely want you to know what he was involved in. Yeah. And he's also like, sometimes these people are related. So Bolivar and Daniel A.P. Murray are related. They're cousins. Oh, wow. So it's like, and Daniel A.P. Murray's family is like ridiculous, like who he's related to. And I'm even finding out that Bolivar is possibly related to another collector, Henry Slaughter, whose collection is in Atlanta at the AUC Library. So they're related, or they know each other in some type of way. He becomes a corresponding member of Schomburg's Historical Society, and they're talking about, I think they call them like the damned fools of their groups of all these people who are interested in all these books. So it's a small world. Yep, he was the second African American to work at the Library of Congress.
So you mentioned a few HBCUs, I think Lincoln, and then also the AUC, which is one. I wonder, did they take these books on the road, outside of Philly to those schools and to different places?
That is an interesting question. I think that some schools may still have some of their stuff. How Bolivar's, not Bolivar, Dorsey, I'm trying to give you, how Dorsey's scrapbooks were discovered. There's actually a whole entire article about it in The Atlantic, was that one day at Cheney, A librarian just happened to go to the basement where some of the other materials were, and 400 of his scrapbooks were just there. So there's probably materials for some of these bibliophiles and collectors that may be in certain collections, but I think that a lot of the institutions have backlog that it just takes time and money to kind of go through those different things. But I would imagine that, yes, they probably do have them at multiple HBCUs throughout the country.
There's scrapbooks in the Gay Harlem Renaissance show, right? Because there's a whole set at Columbia. So even in the 1960s, those were acquired. Because as you said, there was a sense of the enormous importance of all that fragile material that they clipped and glued. I love your description of the physical labor that went into, right? The night after night, and the love, right? Night after night, pasting it down. Yeah, that was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, absolutely. There were more pictures, like even you can kind of see on the sides, like Dorsey's like putting particular things, and he's making annotations about, and that one in particular came from the Education of Colored Literature, something like that. But he's like meticulous with it, and he's very intentional. He will write back to people and tell them like, look, this ain't right. This person was this or that. And they're at Penn State, like there are 400 of them. I was only able to go through maybe 20 at most, but scrapbooks on Frederick Douglass, Phyllis Wheatley, local crime that's going on. He has Native American and indigenous people's literature going throughout his scrapbooks and et cetera. So these people were very smart and creative, and they were trying to think of things to preserve these different materials. So it's amazing.
Is there a sense then that, because you say they all sort of knew each other, so is there a sense that Arturo Schomburg and Dorothy Wesley Porter at Howard, did they all kind of know each other or kind of feed off of each other?
By the time Dorothy Porter or Schomburg and the others, like even Carter G. Woodson, by the time they emerge, I mean, they're dead. Like Adger died in 1910, Dorsey died in 1923, and then by the time like the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History emerges, like they're fragile and they're like going away. Bolivar, I feel like he's the one that really connected. Like he's constantly writing to Schomburg and saying like, hey, can you look up this book when you're in here? And Henry Slaughter is like another person that is really, really amazing that maybe I'll do an article on one day, where he's going through Philadelphia and he notices that Philadelphia is like this really big place for print culture, and he's constantly getting books. But I'm interested to see like more about the books that they have. Did they contact British booksellers? Was it like a French bookseller? Like who are they talking to get some of these books? Because they have an extensive collection. Like one of, I'll say about Bolivar, and I forgot to mention this in the lecture, that was super interesting. Now, I don't know if I believe it or not, but they claim that Bolivar had the only pamphlet of David Walker's Appeal, like at the time, in 1897. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it's interesting that they're talking about it and saying like he has the only copy available because people were burning this book and getting rid of them.
Because you've been doing this research, are you shaping this field? Are people literally reaching out to you and saying, the association records for the Jack and Jill, right? They just surfaced and now we realize they're important. Or the Black Frats. Mm-hmm. Are you stirring up interest, do you think?
Yeah, like even like I'm helping out now so I'm the vice chairman of the Historical Commission for Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I tell brothers every day, like, we need to collect. We need to make sure that we're preserving the materials, and we're now leading an initiative to kind of help with those archives. But I think that everyone around the world kind of knows that this is an issue, and people are beginning to collect more. You'll be surprised how people younger than me are collecting like a lot, like serious bidders or on eBay, and I'm just like, I know exactly who bought that book. It's just like it's a growing thing. But people, as far as like scholarship within the field, I had already reached out to like Laura Helton even before I was in grad school. Just I was like, look, I see a bunch of your stuff, and the things that you're talking about is amazing. So yeah, I mean, I hope so that, but we'll see due in time. Thank you all.